The most excruciating breaking is the one done in complete silence. Every piece of your body hits the floor in the loudest way, yet no one hears the shattering. No one hears because you have perfected the cleanup behind closed doors. And by the time someone looks into your eyes, not a trace of your broken soul remains. I once knew a 3-year-old little girl whose body was tortured. She experienced unending terror, despair, shame, and feelings of powerlessness because she was sexually violated. No one saw her fear or her devastation. No one saw the indescribable pain in her eyes or the brokenness of her soul. Because of this little girl, I have spent my life learning how others endure pain to overcome it. I have wondered how they have endured. I have wondered why they chose to live rather than to die. I pondered how they sheltered and protected themselves literally and metaphorically while enduring assaults to their souls. I looked for signs of the silent screams of agony in others' eyes, similar to what I saw in that little girl's eyes, and wondered if and how suffering and pain could be transmuted to something better. Now, that shattered 3-year-old little girl was me. Although no words can adequately describe what I endured, the enormity of the pain, or the monumental effort it has taken to function in this world, my intent in discussing my suffering with you today is to demonstrate that it is possible and even probable to find shelter from your pain and compassion for your soul so that you can transform your pain into authentic power no matter your circumstances. Now, some of you out there may be thinking that this talk may not apply to you. I posit that it does. According to the NIH, 70% of adults have experienced or will experience a traumatic event at least one time in their lifetime. And evidence suggests this. Every 66 seconds, a woman or child is raped. Every 15 seconds, a woman is beaten. And 49.6 million people are currently being trafficked for sex around the globe, 54% of which are women and female children. These human atrocities need to change. Yet these issues will not change until we recognize that an event need not rise to the level of physical or sexual assault or wartime combat to be considered traumatic and affect a person profoundly. Emotional and verbal abuse, domestic violence, systemic racism, forced displacement, and so many more insidious things can induce post-trauma responses. So today, as a survivor of repeated sexual violence and subsequent mental illness, I'm going to talk to you about some things that I have learned on my journey, most from experience and some from others. Now, life is not easy. Life may have never been or may never be easy, yet we must not unknowingly fall into the trap of victimhood. Rather, we must learn ways to remain empowered. Now, I have been told this more times than I can count, yet no one can tell me the steps to empowerment, the steps to rewiring my brain to for good, the how. So today I'm here to tell you how to transform pain into authentic power, or at least the paradigm that worked for me. To do this, we must first talk about something called the trauma triangle. So the inverted triangle shown on the screen is referred to as a trauma triangle and is often used to describe the ways in which we as survivors of abuse or life present ourselves as victims and how we persecute ourselves as well as how we rescue our souls. So most of us who have suffered trauma or simply endured life unconsciously live from a position of victimhood. The victim is that wounded little inner child that holds all of the pain and shame of that traumatic event. The victim sees life as happening to her and feels powerless to change. In contrast, the persecutor is that part of herself that holds the brutality and hatred of the event that later in life can be acted out towards others or towards oneself. And the rescuer considers the fact that during the event, no one came to stop the violence. And this is of major importance as it creates a part of ourselves that feels unworthy. And later in this life, this role can lead to an inability to care and an inability to set healthy boundaries, leading us, in essence, to abandon ourselves by rescuing others. So this trauma triangle can unknowingly, most of us live in a victim state or somewhere on this triangle, which unconsciously perpetuates trauma responses long after the traumatic event or events have occurred. So this unconscious self-perpetuation of trauma can keep us forever trapped in victimhood. as we continue to subconsciously react to our circumstances from a place of anxiety or powerlessness, as shown on the left side of the screen. But what if we could transform this triangle and intentionally choose to relate to not only with ourselves, with others, from a place of empowerment and trust, rather than from a place of fear, helplessness, and dread? So let's flip the triangle, as shown on the right side of the screen. When we consciously choose to view ourselves and others through the lens of trust and empowerment, the victim metamorphoses into the creator or self-empowered adult. The persecutor now takes on the role of the challenger or empathic parent, and the rescuer assumes a new dynamic role of coach or nurturing parent. But the question is, how can we as trauma survivors or survivors of life actually actively choose to become self-empowered and tap into our inner self-worth? What are the steps? What are the steps that are comprised of that long arrow there? And moreover, what does this have to do with neurobiology? Before answering this question, we must first consider the brain always when we discuss steps to heal from trauma, because untreated trauma can cause multiple progressive brain changes. Trauma that has occurred in childhood or in adulthood can lead to a plethora of brain changes, including chronic inflammation, changes in gene expression, changes in epigenetics, changes in molecular and cellular activity, as well as neurotransmitter levels. And all of this can lead to brain volume loss, structural changes, and changes in brain activity and circuitry. These brain changes that occur in individuals with unresolved trauma have a multifaceted impact on virtually every aspect of a survivor's life. It affects brain development, cognition, emotions, relationships, behaviors, physical well-being, and psychological well-being. In fact, unresolved trauma has a devastating psychological impact and has been linked to suicidality and the development of major depressive disorder, anxiety, panic disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorders, and more. And multiple studies suggest that people who have experienced trauma, they actually die at a younger age. And those with PTSD often die by suicide, supporting the notion that PTSD is a life-threatening brain disease. So what is going on in the brain to cause such anguish and such a disruption in virtually all areas of an individual's life? There are three general regions in the brain: the threat and fear detection regions, shown in yellow and red respectively, and the emotional regulation region, as shown in green. So these regions have an ongoing conversation that compete to control our behavioral responses. When these factions are imbalanced, we feel balanced. Activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is in green, kind of puts a clamp on the fear and threat detection centers in red and yellow, and all feels well. However, when we are violated or attacked physically or psychologically, we become hijacked by our threat detection and fear detection systems. In response, our prefrontal cortex, our rational thinking brain, shown in green, goes offline and cannot give instructions to other regions to suppress them, which gives way to fight, flight, freeze responses. And this leads our threat detection and fear detection systems to dominate, because our brain cannot distinguish the difference between an actual threat and a perceived emotional threat. So this suggests that long after the event has happened, these regions can take control and really potentiate post-trauma responses. Now, trauma of any kind changes the brain, as I said previously, at the molecular, cellular, and structural level. Regions within the prefrontal cortex, again, our rational brain, shown in green, become physically smaller and are gradually unable to connect as strongly with the brain's fear and threat detection centers. So it becomes less efficient in inhibiting fear and threat detection function. So this allows us to become more fearful and more suspicious of, innocuous activities. In addition, in individuals who've experienced trauma, the seat of fear, or the amygdala, which is located in the fear detection system in red, becomes physically enlarged. It has a greater volume and develops stronger connections back to the threat detection center, as well as to a region in the brain known as the hippocampus. And the hippocampus stores traumatic memories. When the amygdala is overactive, it sends fear signals to the hippocampus in response to environmental triggers. And this can lead to a flooding of feelings and our memories associated with previous traumas. and it can cause fight, flight, freeze responses. And because our rational brain, our prefrontal cortex in green, is not online, we feel helpless to deal with these emotional storms. And taken together, these changes lead to the subconscious self perpetuation of fear and trauma. And this was me, actually. I was trapped in a vicious cycle of emotional torture that I could not stop, and I had no idea how to change. For example, when I was no longer being abused, I felt as if my very being had been destroyed by the actions of my abusers. And I experienced violent, intrusive memories that often came without apparent reason and at almost every moment in response to the smallest things. And I didn't know what to do about it, I didn't know how to change. Now, in addition to the above factors, the brain itself has an inherent negativity bias or valence. So, what does that mean? Well, as humans in general, we all tend to remember negative experiences better than positive ones, recall insults better than praise, react more strongly to negative stimuli, think about negative things more frequently than positive ones, and respond more strongly to negative events than to equally positive ones. And a poem written by County Cullen illustrates this concept. It says, once, riding in old Baltimore, head filled, heart filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now, I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me the N word. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. So this shows how we can perseverate on negative things. And this negativity bias is part of the reason that survivors of trauma have such difficulty healing and are perpetually stuck in a cycle of shame, isolation, and depression. Oh no, I'm frozen. Oh no. Hello? I'm having a frozen moment where I can't do anything. Um, anyway, I'll talk without
Hi, Kristen. Hi, Kristen. Can you hear me? Hello. Can anyone hear my voice? Kristen, you're on mute. Could you please unmute and talk? Uh, I think you have some network trouble.
Sorry, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My computer ran into a problem, but let me continue.
Yes, we can hear you. You can continue. Thank you.
Okay. So let me, and I'll go do it without my slides so I have more bandwidth. Let me find, so where I was. So we were talking about the negativity bias and how that creates a cycle of shame and despair, isolation. So next, I will briefly review a different therapeutic modality. Over the years, there have been various approaches used to treat trauma, most with little success. And there are two widely accepted modalities that are used to treat trauma. One is referred to as the top-down approach. When a top-down approach is used, the therapeutic process begins by engaging the cortex or the rational brain. And in general, top-down approaches help an individual identify and change their thoughts and subsequently replace them with more positive thoughts and behaviors, which in theory can change their feelings. And however, top-down approaches generally do not work as thoughts do not always precede emotions. In fact, emotions can happen in survivors of trauma in less than a femtosecond, or that's less than 1/100,000th of a second. At least that has been in my experience. And after the therapy session, I would leave in tears, feeling unheard and uncared for, as I felt so many unresolved feelings and nonverbal sensations that top-down approaches in that therapy session did not effectively address. And the other type of approach or treatment modality involves bottom-up approaches. And these approaches are designed to help individuals explore their feelings and sensations that are a consequence of the previous trauma. So they start focusing on nonverbal sensations and associated emotions. But the problem is they never totally get right up to the brain. So the brain, the cortex, so the cortex really cannot make sense of them. And so they tend to get stuck in these experiences, and these experiences just circle in their brain and they don't become less scary over time. I personally cannot count the number of times that I again walked out of therapy sessions heaving in tears, not knowing how to make it to the next session, because this was because my prefrontal cortex was never able to make meaning of the emotions and sensations explored within the 45-minute session, and I couldn't contain them. So I functioned as a wounded little girl, sobbing on the subway until I got home. And because I did not have an ability to contain these emotions that were too overwhelming for me, I became suicidal and I was flooded with more and more intrusive images. So overall, therapists today really anecdotally say that if you use a top-down plus a bottom-up approach, that is more effective than just using one or the other. So what I did, as I was stuck in a state of fear, depression, and anger, and not anger, and just terror in New York, when I moved to New York City as I was alone, I empirically developed an approach to help me make space for that darkness and contain that darkness and fear of my past. Now, this approach was inspired and adapted from many paradigms, some of which were dialectic behavioral therapy, psychodrama, the writings of Dr. Kate Hudgens, The Neurobiology of Happiness and Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff and colleagues, as well as my personal knowledge of neurobiology and my lived experience. I survived my experiences. And despite that, I remained, as I said, a terrified little girl screaming for help. And I function from the perspective of a hurt child. And many of us do this unknowingly. For me, everything centered around my metaphoric wounded little girl and that lived metaphorically within me. And my goal was to learn to soothe her, nurture her, and love her so that I could find peace. So I both practice and teach the approach that was previously shown on the slide that you did not see. and basically it's a circular approach where healing is not linear. So I meet people where they are. I meet myself where I am. So if a client is experiencing explosive episodes of anger, we start there. Or if they are suicidal, we start there and talk about strategies on how to close the door to suicide. Typically, I first ensure that my clients firmly understand the neurobiologic basis of trauma or mental illness, because that which we understand can hold less fear over us. Next, I help my clients identify their strengths. And I help them associate their strengths with a symbol or a group of symbols. And this is important because the brain uses symbols to function. And it is easier to discuss or envision symbols when someone is in the depths of despair or terror, where places where words are inadequate to describe, or places where words do not exist. We then practice strategies to contain flashbacks and intrusive images, as well as overwhelming emotions. So we actually create containers, whatever the client wants. Everybody's different, for that which is too painful to handle. And we practice putting it in the container and closing it so we don't have to ruminate with these things in our mind all the time. And by working with symbols and using containment and practicing when in an untriggered state, and creating a safe place for the wounded little child within, we can in essence do bottom-up work while keeping the cortex online, as anything too upsetting is immediately locked in a container of the client's choosing, which is analogous to how the cortex sends projections to the limbic system to shut it down. And similarly, we can contain suicidal thoughts, overwhelming feelings of shame, fear, and other things by using symbols and containing them. And by keeping the cortex online while processing the sensory and emotional aspects of one's past, we can more quickly make meaning of these atrocities and reconsolidate the memory, and hopefully the memory will not continue to intrude upon a person's life. Now, for example, I empirically determined how to create a sanctuary to shield myself from the storm of my unbearable emotions until I had the skills to manage them. I therefore decided to give that scared inner little part of myself the same kind of love that I would give anyone else suffering in the same way. I resolved to give her that which I wish I had been given to me. For example, I read her statements of love and care to remind her and myself that we were safe, loved, and not alone. I also wrapped myself and, in essence, her in soft blankets to comfort and console her. In addition, I created an imaginary room for the hurt little girl. It existed in my brain, and as did my shattered younger self. I called it the heart room, and I filled it with heart-shaped couches and pillows and snuggly blankets to remind myself and my little girl that we both had big hearts full of compassion. I painted the walls with rainbows and sunflowers to remind her and myself of the light of hope. I further painted a huge tree that filled all of the walls of the room. Moreover, I stocked the room with coloring books and crayons and books that I voraciously read as a child. When I became scared, I showed my younger self the tree in the room and taught her how its roots spread and anchor deep into the earth, while its branches open wide to the sky with possibility. I also taught her tree pose from yoga, and we metaphysically practiced tree pose together in our metaphoric room to ground us to the earth as we weathered our personal storm that day. And with every breath, we envisioned that our feet remained rooted to the ground and spreading out and rooted all the way to the core of the earth. When my little girl and I felt helpless and in despair, we looked at the sunflowers painted on the walls. I taught her that sunflowers always point the way to the light, as they always look to the sun. And to engender even more hope, we drew a sun together and practiced pointing the sunflowers to the sun. I colored with her. I read to her the books she cherished, and she read them back to me. I taught her gratitude by explaining to her that everyone has dark days filled with clouds, but that if she looked hard enough, there was always a rainbow of kindness in those clouds, such as the gentleness of a teacher, a loving smile from a stranger, or words from a book that helped her learn that a better life was possible. Now, I did all of this as my adult self learned to speak my truth and release the pain of the past. I also released the emotions that kept me trapped in the past. It took time and much hard work, but I was finally able to embrace the tortured little girl within with love and compassion. And in doing so, I slowly rewired my brain from one filled with darkness, fear, despair, and terror to one filled with hope, light, and love. And these techniques are currently being studied as to how they positively impact the brain. So what I'd like to end with is that there are many issues that affect us all. And as women, we have not even begun to test our potential to solve these issues, but it is there. And I challenge you today to remember Dr. Maya Angelou's words, which described all women, no matter their origins, as phenomenal. Phenomenal woman. That's my mother and all of your mothers. And then my grandmother and all of your grandmothers. And my great grandmothers and your great grandmothers. And my great 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 and your great great great. And all of you women here today and me. And so we rise. We rise by being the women who reaches behind and pulls the other woman up to where you are in life. We rise by being the woman who remembers that a simple hello and smile can change someone's day. We rise by remembering that there is a light in you that no darkness can threaten. And we rise by choosing to fight these human issues that I've mentioned previously that affect all women worldwide today. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kristen, for the great presentation. You drew the audience with your presentation. Yes, we do have a question from our audience. So here is
Okay.
the question. So, what advice would you give to individuals struggling with trauma and mental illness who
Mhm.
are looking to transform their pain into authentic power?
What advice would I give them?
Yes.
I would give them, in order to really truly be authentically empowered, you have to find a way to love yourself and to make peace with your past. I mean, your past, if your past was not so great, it's never going to go away, but it can get better and you can have a future. And I would encourage them to go to therapy. I would encourage them to contact me, and I teach a protocol, and I didn't get to show it, but I teach it, and it seems to work for quite a few people.
Yeah, hope everyone got answer. So thank you so much for joining this event and sharing your
Thank
valuable
you.
presentation with Global Virtual Summit 2024. So I would like to, so please join other sessions as well, and please encourage other speakers. And thank you and have a nice day. Bye
You too. Bye, everyone.
bye.